The neighborhood was wrapped in silence, the kind of silence that makes the smallest sound echo like thunder. Porch lights glowed faintly across manicured lawns, casting shadows that stretched long and thin across the street. Inside the homes, families slept soundly, the rhythm of ordinary life undisturbed. The air was heavy with summer heat, dense and unmoving, and not even the cicadas sang that night. It should have been like any other evening. But at 11:47 p.m., the silence cracked open. A 911 dispatcher answered a call. On the other end, a man's voice shook with terror. His words tumbled out too fast, frantic, almost incoherent. He said his wife was missing. He said he had searched every corner of the house. He begged for help, the kind of begging that makes you imagine a man gripping the phone like it was the last rope holding him above water. The dispatcher asked him to slow down. To breathe. To explain. His breaths were shallow. He said she had been in bed beside him when he fell asleep. He said that when he woke, she was gone. Just gone. The dispatcher asked, "When was the last time you saw her?" The pause that followed stretched too long. Long enough for doubt to slip in. Finally, his answer came. Shaky. Uneven. He said only moments ago. That she had been lying next to him. And now she wasn't. By the time officers arrived, the house was still. Too still. No forced entry. No broken glass. No signs of a struggle. Her car sat in the driveway. Keys untouched. Purse neatly on the dresser. Phone on the nightstand. A half-empty glass of water by the bed. To the officers, the scene whispered something unsettling. Angela Coleman had not simply walked out of her home. Mothers clutched children closer. Fathers stood with arms crossed, staring at the house as though waiting for it to confess its secrets. But the house said nothing. And in the center of it all stood Marcus Coleman. Hands shaking. Shirt damp with sweat. His voice cracked as he repeated his story, that he had woken up and found her missing, that he had searched every room, that he had run outside calling her name. But the officers noticed what others missed. The house was too calm, too untouched. There were no signs of panic. No hurried trail of movement. No struggle. Just silence. One officer wrote in his logbook, "No forced entry." No signs of struggle. It was the kind of note that lingers over a case like a shadow. And though Marcus wept, though he begged, though he raised his voice to the sky as if demanding heaven return his wife, something in his eyes unsettled those who watched. His grief looked real. But his calm looked practiced. That night was the beginning of a nightmare. Angela Coleman was gone. And Marcus Coleman was the last person to see her alive. Before she became the woman whose face would one day hang on lampposts and billboards, Angela Coleman was simply a girl who wanted love, safety, and a life that felt her own. She was born in Atlanta in the summer of 1982, the second of 3 daughters in a small house where the fridge sometimes held more hope than food. Her mother, Patricia, worked double shifts at a nursing home. Long nights, sore hands, cracked knuckles from bleach and scrubbing. Angela would sit on the porch at dusk, clutching her schoolbooks, waiting for the sound of her mother's tired footsteps. She promised herself that one day she would give her children a life where love wasn't a luxury and safety wasn't something you had to pray for. Angela wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. But she carried something rare, a softness that drew people to her. Friends said she had a quiet dignity, a warmth that could walk into a room and make it easier to breathe. She didn't crave attention. She didn't compete for space. She listened. She carried people's secrets like treasures, never judging, always holding. Teachers saw her brilliance in English class. She could weave words into poetry, painting feelings on a page that others struggled to name. But sometimes she slipped into silence. Friends remembered moments when she laughed so hard her eyes sparkled, only to find her later staring out a window, lost in thought, her joy swallowed by something deeper. Angela kept a journal under her bed. Pages filled with scribbled lines about loneliness, about never feeling enough, about wanting to be loved so completely that the ache inside her might finally go quiet. She dreamed of building a home filled with light and laughter, a place where her children would never doubt that they were wanted. When she met Marcus Coleman at 20, she thought she had found her answer. Marcus was older, confident, handsome in a way that turned heads. But what captured her was his charm, the way he noticed her, the way he asked questions no one else thought to ask. He told her she was beautiful, not just in her looks but in her spirit. He told her she was special, chosen. For a girl who had spent her life yearning to feel safe and wanted, those words felt like salvation. They married young, in a small church with peeling paint and a choir that sang loud enough to cover the cracks in the walls. She wore a borrowed dress. He wore a suit a size too small across the shoulders. They didn't have much money, but they had promises. And Angela believed those promises with her whole heart. Their first child, a boy, was born 2 years later. Angela adored him. She poured every ounce of herself into motherhood, staying up through sleepless nights, rocking him until dawn, humming lullabies she made up on the spot. Her friends said motherhood looked natural on her, like she had been born for it. But her journal told another story. She wrote about exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to fix. About tears that came without warning. About moments where she stared at her baby, overwhelmed not by love but by fear, fear that she wasn't good enough, fear that she would fail him the way she had once felt failed. Marcus brushed it off. He told her she was just tired, that all new mothers felt that way. Her mother told her to pray, to be strong. And Angela tried. She smiled through family gatherings. She laughed when friends visited. But the shadows in her eyes never fully left. Still, she pressed on. When their second child, a daughter, was born, Angela felt joy mixed with dread. She held the baby close, whispering prayers into her tiny ear, promising to keep her safe. But her journal filled again with darker words. I don't feel like myself anymore. I feel like I'm disappearing. And yet, to the outside world, Angela Coleman was the picture of grace. A devoted wife. A loving mother. A woman with a warm smile and a gentle touch. No one saw the fractures. No one knew the depth of the silence she carried. Her closest friend, Danielle, remembered one late-night phone call. Angela's voice was tight, trembling. She whispered, "If anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll look after the kids." Danielle laughed nervously, brushing it off as exhaustion. But Angela's silence on the other end of the line lingered. Heavy. Haunting. Angela Coleman had built the life she once dreamed of. But behind the curtains of that suburban home, cracks were spreading. Cracks that no one wanted to name. And soon, those cracks would shatter everything. The morning after Angela vanished, the Coleman home no longer looked like the picture of safety it once pretended to be. Police tape fluttered in the heavy Georgia air, sunlight glinting off the yellow strands that now marked the house not as a home, but as a scene. Marcus Coleman stood in the yard, his shirt wrinkled, his hair damp with sweat. His voice cracked as reporters shoved microphones toward him. He said the words every community dreads, "My wife is missing. Please, please help us bring her back." His face glistened with tears. His shoulders shook as he clutched a photograph of Angela, holding it up to the cameras as if offering proof that she had once been real. To the neighbors, he looked broken. A husband shattered. A father holding on by a thread. Women cried at the sight of him. Men shook his hand firmly, telling him to stay strong. Pastors prayed over him, their voices trembling as they lifted his name to heaven. But detectives in the crowd watched differently. One of them scribbled in his notebook, "His grief is too clean." Because grief, real grief, is messy. It is wild. It doesn't know where to sit or how to breathe. But Marcus's grief looked rehearsed. His tears came when cameras were near. His pauses were timed just long enough for the microphones to catch the sob in his throat. And when the lights dimmed, his composure returned a little too quickly. Angela's closest friend, Danielle, watched from the back of the crowd, her fists clenched at her sides. She had known Angela since they were 12, since summer afternoons spent whispering secrets under an oak tree. She had heard Angela's laughter, her fears, her hopes. She knew the sound of her best friend's real joy, and she knew the sound of her hidden pain. When Marcus spoke that morning, Danielle felt her stomach twist. His words didn't sound like love. They sounded like lines. She whispered under her breath, so soft only she could hear, "You're lying." The search began before the sun was fully up. Volunteers combed through fields, woods, and shallow riverbanks. Boots pressed into dirt. Flashlights cut through the early morning mist. Every rustle in the trees made hearts race. Every shadow looked like hope. Posters went up, Angela's face smiling from lampposts, grocery store bulletin boards, church doors. Her children's eyes stared at the photos as though they could pull their mother back by looking hard enough. At a vigil one night, Marcus stood beside him, his arm draped protectively over his son's shoulders. Cameras zoomed in. His voice broke in all the right places as he told the crowd, "Angela was my everything. My heart. My soul. Please, if anyone knows anything, I beg you, help us." The footage ran on every local news station. To the world, he was the grieving widower. The man who had lost the love of his life. But in private, detectives began building a profile. They noticed the delay between Angela's disappearance and his 911 call. They noted the sweat on his shirt, the dampness of his hair, the way his hands shook while his eyes stayed too steady. They wrote down the strange calmness, the long explanations no one had asked for. And then there were the whispers. Some neighbors said they had seen Marcus with another woman. A younger woman. They said her car had been in his driveway when Angela wasn't around. They said he had been too quick to smile at her, too comfortable in her company. Angela had noticed too. Her journal hinted at betrayal. In one entry, her handwriting uneven and pressed hard into the page, she wrote, "I think he's seeing someone else. He denies it, but I feel it. I'm scared. Not of losing him, but of what he might do if I confront him." Danielle remembered that journal, tucked away in Angela's dresser under folded sweaters. She hadn't read it, but she had seen it. Now, she prayed the police would find it. Because she knew, deep down, Angela had left them something. A trail of truth. The community clung to hope. Candlelight vigils filled the streets, flames flickering against the night sky like 1,000 prayers. Children held signs that said, "Bring Angela home." Churches opened their doors for prayer circles. Volunteers refused to stop searching, even when days turned into weeks. But with each sunrise, the hope dimmed. And Danielle's suspicion grew. One night, as Marcus stood before cameras again, his voice breaking on cue, Danielle leaned to another friend and whispered, "He's performing. I can see it in his eyes." She remembered Angela's last warning. "If anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll look after the kids." Those words rang in her ears like a prophecy. And as the search stretched on, the truth began to feel closer. Like something buried just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Angela was missing. But Danielle was certain of one thing. Angela hadn't just vanished. Marcus knew more than he was saying. And the cracks in his performance were beginning to show. The call came on a sweltering afternoon. A fisherman had stumbled on something in the woods by the riverbank, a body burned beyond recognition. Police swarmed the scene, their boots sinking into damp earth, their flashlights cutting across charred remains that barely looked human. The smell of ash clung to the air, heavy and suffocating. They whispered to each other in tones reserved for nightmares, "This could be her." Days later, the coroner's office confirmed what everyone feared. The remains were identified as Angela Coleman. The news shattered the community. When Angela's mother heard, she collapsed on the kitchen floor, her cries so raw they pierced through walls. Neighbors rushed in, but there was no comforting a mother who had just learned her daughter was never coming home. Her wails echoed through the house until her voice gave out, leaving only the sound of a broken woman gasping for air. Danielle, Angela's lifelong friend, fell into a chair when she heard the news. Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head violently. "No," she whispered to herself. "No, no, no. This isn't right." She replayed Angela's warning in her mind like a broken record, "If anything ever happens to me, don't believe him." But the world did believe him. Marcus Coleman began planning a funeral. The church was overflowing. Every pew filled with mourners dressed in black, their faces drawn with grief. The air was heavy with perfume, sweat, and sorrow. Fans waved slowly in trembling hands. Children sat stiffly, confused, their small voices asking, "Why can't Mommy come back?" At the front of the sanctuary stood a casket draped with lilies, gleaming under the dim light. A portrait of Angela rested beside it, her smile frozen in time, a cruel reminder of the warmth that had been stolen. The choir sang low, mournful hymns. The sound trembled as it rose to the rafters. Women clutched tissues, men bowed their heads. The atmosphere was thick with grief, with disbelief, with the weight of finality. Angela's mother sat in the front row, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably, her cries breaking the silence. When the choir began to sing Amazing Grace, her son's small voice cracked as he whispered, "Mommy liked this song." The words rippled through the church like lightning, leaving everyone shattered. And then, Marcus rose. He walked slowly to the pulpit, his head bowed, his shoulders heavy. The congregation hushed, waiting. His hands trembled as he gripped the podium. His voice wavered as he spoke. "Angela," he paused, choking back a sob. "Angela was my heart. My soul. My everything. There's no one like her. She was a wife, a mother, a friend. She was the light of this community. And now, that light is gone." He wiped his eyes with a tissue, his face twisted in sorrow. His voice cracked perfectly, the kind of crack that moved people to tears. "I don't know how to raise these children without her. I don't know how to breathe without her. I don't know how to live in a world that doesn't have Angela in it." The congregation wept openly. Some shouted, "Amen." Others stood and clapped, moved by his words. Cameras clicked, capturing the image of a man broken by loss, a father drowning in grief. But in the back row, Danielle sat rigid, her fists clenched. She studied every movement, every pause, every carefully timed tear. She remembered Angela's journal. She remembered the late-night phone call. And as Marcus's voice broke on cue, Danielle whispered into her tissue, "You're performing." The service continued. Friends stood to speak of Angela's kindness, the way she cooked meals for neighbors, the way her laughter filled a room, the way her love for her children seemed endless. Every story painted a portrait of the woman she truly was, radiant, strong, full of life. And with each story, the weight of her absence pressed harder on every chest. The casket was lowered into the ground that afternoon. Soil thudded heavily against the wood. Lilies wilted as they fell. Angela's children clung to each other, their small bodies trembling, their faces wet with tears. Marcus stood behind them, his arm draped across their shoulders, his head bowed, his face hidden. To the world, it was the final chapter of a tragic story. But to Danielle, it was a lie. Because as much as she grieved, as much as she longed for her friend, something inside her refused to believe Angela was truly gone. The look in Marcus's eyes wasn't grief. It was something colder. Sharper. And when Danielle whispered, "I don't believe you," she didn't just mean Marcus. She meant the entire performance. The funeral. The casket. The tears. It was a play. A production staged for cameras and neighbors. And she was certain, absolutely certain, that Marcus Coleman was hiding something. Something terrible. 2 years. That's how long the world believed Angela Coleman was dead. Her headstone still stood in the cemetery, etched with her name, her birth date, and a lie carved in stone, 1982 to 2016. Mourners laid flowers. Children whispered prayers. Friends stopped by to sit at the grave, speaking softly to the earth as though Angela might still hear them. Marcus Coleman walked those same cemetery grounds with his arm around another woman. Sierra Banks. Young, vibrant, smiling awkwardly under the stares of neighbors. Whispers followed them everywhere, too soon. Too disrespectful. Too strange. But Marcus brushed it off. He told anyone who asked that he was healing. That he was moving forward. That life, cruel as it had been, had given him a second chance. And for a time, it seemed he had one. The community pitied him. The church embraced him. And Marcus lived like a man who had buried his secrets 6 feet under. But secrets don't stay buried forever. One quiet afternoon, in a police station 2 counties away, officers looked up from their desks as the door creaked open. The room froze. Conversations cut short. Pens dropped from hands. A woman stepped in. Her body was thinner, her face sharper, her eyes hard. Her hair was cut shorter than before, her clothes worn, her hands trembling. But her presence was unmistakable. It was Angela Coleman. Alive. A pair of eyes was locked on the woman who had walked out of her own grave. Angela's lips trembled as she placed her hands on the counter. Her voice cracked, but her words were clear. My husband tried to kill me. The room erupted. Phones rang. Radios buzzed. Supervisors rushed in, demanding explanations that no one could give. Angela Coleman, the woman who had been mourned, buried, eulogized, was standing in front of them, alive, her heart still beating, her eyes burning with the truth. Her story spilled out in fragments, each word shaking with the weight of memory. The night she disappeared, Marcus had lured her into the woods. He told her they needed to talk. He told her he wanted peace. But once they were alone, his mask slipped. His hands were on her throat, pressing, squeezing, cutting the air from her lungs. She remembered the stars above her spinning. The roar of blood in her ears. The sound of her own heartbeat pounding louder than her screams. I thought I was going to die, Angela whispered. I thought my children would wake up and never see me again. But she didn't die. Something inside her, the memory of her son's laughter, the feel of her daughter's tiny hand in hers, refused to let go. She clawed, she kicked, she tore at Marcus's arms with everything she had left. Somehow, impossibly, she broke free. She ran barefoot through the woods, branches slicing her skin, rocks tearing her feet. She could hear him behind her, cursing, shouting, chasing. She ran until her body gave out, until the sound of his pursuit faded into silence. She collapsed in a ditch, gasping, her body trembling, her throat raw. And when morning came, she ran again. For weeks, Angela lived like a ghost. She hid in shelters, gave false names, moved from town to town. She slept in bus stations when she couldn't afford a motel. She begged for food. She watched her own casket lowered into the ground. She screamed into the pillow that night, clutching her chest as though her heart might burst from the unbearable weight of being alive while the world buried her. He buried me, she said through tears in the police station. He buried me while I was still alive. And worse, Marcus had not buried her at all. The burned body found near the riverbank. It was another woman. Another daughter. Another life Marcus had stolen to cover his crime. Angela's voice cracked as she said the words, "That wasn't me. That was someone else." And he thought the world would never know. But the world knew now. News spread like fire. Angela Coleman is alive. Headlines screamed it. Social media exploded with disbelief. How is this possible? Who was buried in her place? And in the Coleman neighborhood, shock rolled through the streets like thunder. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers muttered curses under their breath. The man who had performed grief so flawlessly. The man who had stood at a pulpit and cried over a coffin that didn't hold his wife. The man who thought he had buried his past. His past had walked back into the light. Angela Coleman wasn't just alive. She was ready to testify. And the empire of lies Marcus had built began to crumble the moment she spoke. The courthouse had never seen anything like it. From sunrise, the steps outside filled with reporters, their cameras flashing like lightning, microphones thrust forward, voices echoing over one another. Inside, benches overflowed. Strangers who had never met Angela Coleman pressed into wooden pews just to say they were there when history was made. Mothers clutched babies close, fathers sat with their jaws tight, and neighbors whispered in awe, "She's alive, she's really alive." And at the center of it all, Marcus Coleman. The once grieving widower, the man who cried into microphones and begged for his wife's return, now sat in a crisp suit that could not hide his fear. His eyes darted around the room, his fingers drummed nervously on the table. He tried to hold the mask, but the mask had cracks. Across the aisle sat Angela. Alive. Breathing. Every heartbeat of hers was a nail driven into the coffin of Marcus's lies. Her presence alone shattered his story, her very existence undoing years of deception. The prosecutor began with fire. His voice thundered across the silent courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are about to hear the most shocking story this courthouse has ever witnessed. A man who thought he could bury the truth. A man who strangled his wife, left her for dead, buried another woman in her place, and stood before you all, crying crocodile tears over a coffin that never held Angela Coleman. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he had gotten away with it. But today, you will hear from the woman herself. Angela Coleman, the wife he tried to kill, the mother he tried to erase, the woman who refused to die." The words hit like a hammer. Jurors shifted in their seats, eyes wide, some already glistening with tears. Spectators leaned forward, breath caught in their throats. And Marcus? He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening, a flicker of panic flashing across his face. The defense rose quickly, desperate to counter. They painted Angela as unstable. They said she was a woman with a history of paranoia, prone to exaggerations. They claimed she had staged her own disappearance, that she had abandoned her family out of spite, that she had returned now only to ruin Marcus out of vengeance. But then Angela took the stand. The gallery gasped. The jurors leaned forward. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across paper. Angela raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth, and turned to face the jury. Her voice trembled at first, but her eyes were steady. And when she began to speak, the entire courtroom seemed to lean closer, as if afraid to miss a single word. She told them everything. The nights of fear. The bruising grip on her arm. The journal pages where she had written, "If anything happens to me, it's Marcus." The night in the woods. His hands crushing her throat, her vision going dark, the stars spinning above her. The sprint through branches and dirt, barefoot, gasping, clawing for life. The motel rooms. The bus stations. The TV screen where she saw her own funeral, her own obituary, her own children crying over a casket that did not hold her. Her voice cracked when she said, "I was alive while he buried another woman and told you it was me." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some wept openly. A juror covered her mouth, eyes wide with horror. The judge pounded the gavel, demanding order, but the emotion could not be contained. Marcus sat rigid, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle twitched. For the first time, the mask was gone. He looked not like a grieving husband, but like a man cornered by the very ghost he had buried. Then came the forensics. Experts testified that the body found burned by the riverbank was not Angela's. Dental records and DNA proved it belonged to another woman, a woman Marcus had lured, killed, and used as a stand-in for his wife. The gallery froze in horror. The prosecutor held up Angela's journal next. He read aloud the words that now rang like prophecy, "If anything happens to me, it's Marcus. Promise me someone will protect the children." Angela sat silently as her words filled the courtroom, her tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling in her lap. The jury watched Marcus closely now. They saw the way his shoulders slumped, the way his face paled, the way his lips pressed into a thin line. His performance was over. His stage had collapsed. And then came the moment that broke him completely. Angela, still on the stand, turned her eyes directly to Marcus. Her voice, cracked but fierce, carried across the room. "You tried to kill me. You buried me. But I am still here. You failed." The words cut deeper than any lawyer's argument ever could. The gallery erupted. Some shouted. Some wept. The judge's gavel thundered, but even he could not silence the weight of what had just been said. For Marcus, it was the end. For Angela, it was resurrection made flesh. The jury deliberated for hours, tension thick as smoke in the courthouse halls. Families prayed. Reporters rehearsed headlines. Angela sat with her children, her hands gripping theirs so tightly they turned white. When the jury returned, the foreman's voice shook as he read the verdict. On the charge of attempted murder, guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder, guilty. On the charge of fraud and deception, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Cries, gasps, sobs of relief and rage tangled together in a storm of emotion. Angela collapsed into her children's arms, their tears mingling, their voices whispering, "Mommy's here. Mommy's safe." Marcus sat stone-faced, the reality of a life sentence pressing down on him. The cameras no longer saw a grieving widower. They saw a murderer, a liar, a man stripped bare by the truth he thought he had buried. And in that moment, Angela Coleman was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor. The verdict was read. Marcus Coleman, once a husband, once a father, once the man who convinced an entire community that he was broken by grief, was sentenced to life without parole. But justice does not erase scars. Angela walked out of that courthouse with the weight of victory and the ache of survival pressed into her chest. She whispered through her tears, "We're safe now. Mommy's here. I'll never leave you again." But safety doesn't come with a verdict. Healing doesn't arrive in a sentence. Survival lingers long after the trial ends. Angela returned to the same house where she had grown up. The walls, once painted in cheerful pinks and yellows, now felt too quiet, too heavy. The nights were the hardest. She would jolt awake, her breath trapped in her chest, her hands clawing at her throat as though Marcus's grip still lingered in the dark. Sweat soaked her sheets. Her children's cries would pierce the silence, not because of nightmares of their own, but because they had learned to wake at the sound of her screams. Her son clung tighter than before, often curling into her side at night, whispering, "Don't leave again, Mommy. Don't go away." Her daughter refused to let her hand go at school drop-off, her tiny fingers trembling until Angela promised she would be there when the bell rang. Angela became their anchor, but inside, she was still adrift. She sought therapy, week after week, sitting in a quiet office with walls painted in calming blues, speaking words she had once thought unspeakable. She spoke of the night in the woods, of the funeral she watched from a motel television, of the unbearable ache of knowing her children wept over a casket that did not hold her. She cried until her voice cracked, until her body shook. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to rebuild herself. But trauma has echoes. Sometimes, even laughter felt like a betrayal. A simple moment of joy could collapse into guilt. And then there was the grave. Her headstone still stood in the cemetery. The stone etched with her name. Her birthday. And a death date that wasn't hers. 1982 to 2016. She visited it once. Just once. Her children by her side, their eyes wide, their small voices whispering questions she could not answer. Angela stood above that stone in silence. Flowers wilted at its base, left by mourners who never knew the truth. Her hand trembled as she touched the cold granite, staring down at a monument to her own false death. It was surreal. It was cruel. It was Marcus's final attempt to erase her, made real in stone. She whispered, "You didn't win." And then she walked away. Angela's healing came not just from therapy, but from speaking. At first, she sat in small rooms at women's shelters, listening to other survivors. She spoke hesitantly, her voice trembling, but with every retelling, her words grew stronger. She told them, "I was buried alive in lies. But I came back. And so can you." Her story spread. Newspapers published her words. Advocacy groups invited her to speak. And soon, Angela founded Angela's Promise, a nonprofit dedicated to helping women escape abusive relationships before it was too late. Her mission was not about fame. It was about ensuring that no other woman would watch her children cry over a coffin she wasn't in. Her children grew with her. Her son began to smile again, though his laughter carried an edge of maturity too heavy for his young years. Her daughter clung less tightly, her small world opening once more as she learned her mother was not going anywhere this time. Angela poured herself into them, into ensuring that their childhoods, though scarred, would not be defined by grief. And yet, Angela never forgot. She knew Marcus would die in prison, but that didn't erase the years he had stolen. The birthdays missed. The nights spent alone in fear. The memories that no therapy session could ever fully wash away. She carried them. She always would. But she carried something else too, defiance. She was alive. Breathing. Free. Marcus had tried to write her ending with his hands around her throat. He had thought he could bury her and replace her. He had thought he could lie to the world and live untouched. But Angela's survival ripped the mask from his face and forced the truth into the light. And now, when she stood on stages or sat across from broken women who thought they couldn't survive, she told them, "I am still here. You can be too." Angela Coleman's story is not just one of crime. It is one of resurrection. Of betrayal. Of survival. Of a woman who clawed her way out of the grave her husband dug for her and stood taller than ever before. Her husband thought he had gotten away with it. He thought the world would forget her. He thought she was gone forever. But Angela came back. And with every breath, every word, every moment she lives in freedom, she proves that the dead do not stay silent. Angela Coleman's life is proof that survival is not always quiet. Sometimes it roars back from the grave, demanding to be heard. And now, as her story comes to an end here, I ask you, how many Angelas are still out there? How many women whisper, "If anything happens to me," while no one listens? If you believe her story must be told, if you believe no voice should ever be buried, then share this video right now. Someone you know may need to hear it. And if you want more stories of survival, betrayal, and truth, stories the world tries to bury, subscribe to this channel. Because sometimes, the only way to honor the survivors, is to never let their story die.